There is a profound misconception about power, especially the kind that builds empires in the shadows. We believe it is accrued through acts of decisive violence, through the clear, thunderous statement of a gunshot. The narrative is clean. The man who pulls the trigger earns the fear, and fear becomes authority. But the true architects of dominion understand something more subtle and infinitely more potent. Real power isn't in the noise of creation, it's in the silence of curation. It's not about being the author of the explosion, but being the one who controls the narrative of the fallout, who owns the echo, and who builds his fortress from the scattered rubble left by others. No one understood this better than Carlo Gambino, and no single event proves it more than the day a .38 caliber bullet tore through the skull of Albert Anastasia in the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel. Gambino's hands were clean. He never touched the gun. But in the chaotic, deafening silence that followed that shot, only one man had the blueprint, the patience, and the cold, analytical mind to assemble the fragments into a throne. He didn't fire the shot, but the sound of that gunshot didn't signal an end. It was the first note in the symphony of his empire. To appreciate the architecture, you must first survey the landscape before the demolition. The American underworld of the mid-1950s was a precarious, glittering structure built on a fault line. The old ethnic-based gangs had been organized, corporatized, if you will, by Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky into the Commission, a board of directors for crime. But it was an uneasy merger. At the top of the volatile, violent wing of this corporation sat Albert Anastasia, formerly Umberto Anastasio, the Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated. Anastasia was not a strategist or a financier. He was a primal force. His power was pure kinetic energy, a terrifying, unpredictable capacity for rage and violence that served as the syndicate's ultimate enforcement mechanism. He was the monster they all pointed to when diplomacy failed. And he was, by all accounts, becoming a liability. His temper was volcanic, his ambitions messy, and in the new post-Kefauver hearing world, his very public notoriety was a dangerous spotlight. He was a live wire dangling over a pool of gasoline. And sitting in the shadows, watching the spark, was Carlo Gambino. Gambino was Anastasia's underboss in what was then the Mangano family, after Vincent Mangano, whom Anastasia had likely murdered. He was the antithesis of his boss, small, quiet, owlish, a man who spoke in Sicilian proverbs and measured his words like gold. He was a consigliere in a bomber jacket's body. Where Anastasia saw problems to be obliterated, Gambino saw systems to be managed, equations to be balanced. He understood that Anastasia's greatest weakness wasn't his cruelty, but his simplicity. In a world moving towards complex financial rackets and political corruption, a pure avatar of violence was an antique and a dangerous one. The trigger was pulled on the morning of October 25, 1957. Two masked men walked into the barbershop of the Park Sheraton, where Anastasia was getting a haircut, shoved the barber aside, and opened fire. Anastasia, the man who had ordered hundreds to their deaths, died in a frantic, undignified scramble, shot in the back of the head. The shooters vanished. The case was never officially solved. The immediate aftermath was pandemonium wrapped in silence. The underworld held its breath. Who had dared? More importantly, what came next? The monster in the basement was dead. Who controlled the basement now? This was the critical juncture, the moment of maximum fragility and opportunity. And while other powerful men, like the scheming Vito Genovese, saw a power vacuum to be rushed into, Carlo Gambino saw a construction site. Gambino's genius was in his understanding of cause and effect and his mastery of the second-order effect. The first-order effect of the hit was the removal of Anastasia. The second-order effect, the one that truly mattered, was the psychological state of everyone else.
The capos and soldiers of the family were terrified and leaderless. The other commission bosses were anxious and suspicious, looking at each other with renewed paranoia. The law was circling, expecting a bloody war of succession. Gambino moved, not with an army, but with a narrative. He didn't claim credit for the hit. That would have made him a target and a disruptor. Instead, he positioned himself as the sole pillar of stability in the earthquake. He became the grieving lieutenant, the responsible steward. He spoke of the tragedy, of carrying on Albert's legacy, of keeping the peace for the good of the family and our friends. His language was never of conquest, but of continuity and calm. He met with the family's captains not to demand loyalty, but to offer stability. He assured their operations would remain untouched, their tributes fair, the heat from the police managed. He presented himself not as a new king, but the competent, quiet administrator who would prevent the kingdom from collapsing into civil war. It was an offer they couldn't refuse, because the alternative was chaos, and they had just seen where chaos led. Simultaneously, he worked the political angle with the other bosses. To the commission, he framed Anastasia's removal not as a coup, but as a necessary, if regrettable, corporate restructuring. Anastasia had become a rogue element, a danger to the entire syndicate with his volatile behavior. His death, while tragic, restored equilibrium. Gambino, with his calm, rational demeanor, was the logical successor to manage that volatile asset, the former Anastasia crew. He wasn't grabbing power, he was reluctantly accepting a heavy burden to preserve the peace and profits for everyone. He made his ascension seem like a collective necessity, a service to the greater good of the organization. This was political jujitsu of the highest order. He used the fear and uncertainty created by the gunshot to make his leadership appear to be the only safe harbor. The gunshot itself was a blunt, anonymous instrument, but its echo, the fear, the silence, the vacuum, was a malleable material, and Gambino was a master sculptor. He built his empire not from bricks of fear he himself fired, but from the collective sigh of relief he orchestrated. He took the violent, terrifying energy of the Anastasia era and transformed it, through his own calm, into a new kind of power, bureaucratic, institutional, and far more durable. The Gambino crime family, which would bear his name for decades and become the most powerful in the nation, was not founded on a moment of violence, but on a masterful, strategic analysis of the aftermath of violence. He didn't win a war. He conducted a flawless audit of a catastrophe and emerged as the sole viable CEO. The legacy of that barbershop shot is a timeless lesson in indirect power. Carlo Gambino proved that the most powerful person in the room is often not the one who creates the crisis, but the one who is best prepared to resolve it on his own terms. He understood that in the geography of power, the high ground is not taken by charging up the hill under fire, but by being the only one with a map when the smoke clears. The sound of the gunshot was the bell that ended one era, but in the ringing silence that followed, only one man knew how to write the Constitution for the next. He built an empire not with a trigger finger, but with an economist's mind, a psychologist's insight, and the patience to let someone else make the noise that would become his foundation. In the end, the bang belonged to a nameless shooter, but the profound, shaping silence that followed, that belonged entirely to Carlo Gambino. That silence was not an absence, but a medium, a fertile, dark soil in which Gambino planted the seeds of a new kind of criminal enterprise. The bang was the flash of lightning. Gambino was the one who controlled the rain that followed, determining which seeds would sprout and which would rot. His first act was not to appoint new captains or seize territories, but to instill a doctrine. The doctrine was low profile, high profit. The Anastasia era had been one of terrifying spectacle, a public, almost mythological violence that drew the gaze of newspapers and Senate committees. Gambino's first commandment was to vanish from that gaze. He ordered a retreat from the garish, headline-grabbing rackets. Extortion had to be quieter, less personal. Loan sharking became a matter of ledger entries and polite, firm reminders, not broken knees on a public street corner. He pushed the family's capital into the less volatile, more complex worlds of legitimate-seeming business: garment center unions, private sanitation carting, construction concrete, and, most lucratively, the waterfront. The docks of New York, with their labyrinthine system of kickbacks, phantom employees, and stifled competition, became a Gambino fiefdom, not through muscle, but through paperwork, union control, and the strategic placement of compliant officials. The violence didn't disappear, but it became a last resort, a tool kept in a locked drawer and used only by specialized, deniable personnel.
This new everything was not a static kingdom, but a living, adapting organism engineered for survival in a changing world. The post-Anastasia landscape demanded more than just a change in management style. It demanded an evolution in the very DNA of a crime family. Gambino oversaw this evolution with the cold eye of a Darwinian biologist. He understood that the external environment, the heat from law enforcement, the scrutiny of the media, the shifting economic landscape of post-war America, was becoming increasingly hostile to the old reptilian-brained model of gangsterism. The family needed a cortex. It needed to be smarter, not just tougher. It needed to develop symbiotic relationships with the host body of legitimate society, not just be a parasitic tumor easily identified and targeted for removal. His most significant innovation was the formalization of what had been ad hoc corruption into a streamlined, business-like process. Where previous bosses might have relied on intimidating a specific official for a specific favor, Gambino invested in building long-term assets within the system. He didn't just bribe a city inspector, he helped fund the campaign of the city councilman who oversaw the Department of Inspections, cultivated a relationship with his chief of staff, and placed a consultant from a Gambino-linked construction firm on the councilman's advisory board. This created a self-sustaining ecosystem of influence. The corruption became structural, not personal. It was harder to trace, more resilient to individual scandals, and it generated returns on investment for decades, not just for a single construction permit. He applied this same principle to labor unions, the court system, and the shipping industry. The family became a silent, minority shareholder in the machinery of New York itself. This corporatization had a paradoxical effect on the internal culture of the family. The old mafia-centric codes of omerta and blood honor remained the sacred liturgy, the binding mythology, but the day-to-day operations ran on a secular, pragmatic ethos of profit and risk assessment. A soldier wasn't rewarded primarily for being stand-up or tough, though that was still a prerequisite. He was rewarded for being a good earner who didn't attract attention. Loyalty was still demanded, but it was increasingly framed as loyalty to the family business, an entity that promised pensions, opportunities for advancement into semi-legitimate ventures, and protection, rather than just loyalty to a charismatic or terrifying chief. Gambino, in his grandfatherly guise, became the personification of this corporate benevolence. He was the CEO who remembered your kid's name and gave a generous gift at a wedding, all while his board of directors, the capos, and department heads, the crew leaders, ensured the quarterly targets were met by any means necessary. The sound of the Anastasia shot, therefore, didn't just build an empire of rackets, it built an empire of narratives. For the public and the press, the narrative was the end of the wild mobster era. The scary, famous names were gone. For the law, the narrative became one of frustrating complexity, of cases that fell apart when key witnesses developed amnesia, or when paper trails vanished into a maze of shell corporations. For the man on the street, the narrative was that the mob